All right, we've got a nice little slate of Week 4 games in college football as things start to get cranked up and we get close to conference play in many of the conferences across college football in Power 5 college football. We bring in Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com as only he can do it in sizing of these games, so I need some help here, Joe. We bring you in here and love doing this each and every week. So I'm going to get started for us right here on Thursday night. Man, this is a nice little matchup on paper. I think it's going to get out of hand, though. Kansas State, always the little engine that could. Man, you got to give Bill Snyder so much credit for building a football program that competes with the likes of Oklahoma and Baylor and Texas and Oklahoma State. Does a great job there. But Auburn coming in with all that firepower on offense. So we got Auburn number 5, Kansas State number 20 in Manhattan on Thursday night.
Well, on paper, it looks like Kansas State might have a shot. They're only giving up 87 rushing yards per game, have a very solid quarterback in Jake Waters. But when you look at their MO in 2013, Mark, teams that they lost to, Oklahoma State, Baylor, Texas, and Oklahoma all had significant speed against the Kansas State Wildcats. Going to be a crazy atmosphere in Manhattan, Kansas. Great stadium, but it's something that Auburn hasn't seen before. It's not going to be anything different than playing in Baton Rouge in Death Valley or in the SEC championship game or in the national championship game. They're coming off a bye. You look at Nick Marshall and that offense, I think they dictate the tempo. I think they're going to put a lot of pressure on that Wildcat defense. I think Auburn gives everything they have, and it's a dominant Tiger victory on Thursday night.
Yeah, Kansas State pretty much has to play the perfect game, and they probably will come close. Bill Snyder will have them ready. They'll be fundamentally sound. They'll be in the right position, but sometimes you just can't account for athleticism and speed. And Auburn, that rushing attack, hey, if they could throw up the kind of numbers they did against Alabama, Missouri in the SEC championship game, and even Florida State, wow, Kansas State I think is going to get overwhelmed, may hang in for a half. Not a ridiculous blowout, but I think it's a 3-touchdown game. All right, we got Georgia Tech, we got Virginia Tech, the Hokies. Wow, they stun Ohio State and Columbus, then they, bam, big letdown against East Carolina and Shane Carden. Almost came back to pull out a win after sleeping early in that game and getting down 21-0. Georgia Tech has yet to play anyone, barely got past Georgia Southern last week.
I mean, when you look at both of these games, I'm very shocked with the effort by Virginia Tech last weekend. I actually thought in the first couple of series that the Hokies' defense was very aggressive. They really were in Shane Carden's face on Saturday in Lane Stadium. A couple of deflected passes, a couple of jump balls, and the next thing you knew, East Carolina was up 21-0, put a lot of pressure on Michael Brewer and that Hokie offense, but they did respond. Defense shut down East Carolina for much of the second half. That game got tied up 21 apiece, and then all of a sudden East Carolina and Justin Hardy really made the plays to put the game away at 28-21. So when you look at this game on Saturday, I think it does favor Virginia Tech because of their defense. Georgia Tech not looking good, all one-dimensional with the rushing attack. You look at that performance last week in Atlanta, getting pushed to the limit against Georgia Southern. I just think Virginia Tech is the superior team. I look for Bud Foster's defense to step up. I think Virginia Tech rebounds in a big way.
Let's stay in the ACC, or at least with an ACC team, as Virginia. This is just an odd situation where they lose so many consecutive games. The last time they won was against a BYU team that turned out to be pretty good last year. They go on the long losing streak. They play really well against UCLA, don't get the win because of the 3 UCLA defensive touchdowns, but then they pull out, I'm not going to say a shocker, that might be hyperbole, but it was a very good win at home against the Louisville team that looked so rock solid against Miami. So now we got a rematch from last year. Virginia, BYU, the Cougars, kind of that odd man out in the Power 5 structure, really need to go undefeated and hope for just all hell to break loose elsewhere.
Well, I agree. When you look at BYU last Thursday night, they got pushed to the limit by Houston. I said last week's show that Houston matched up very well against the Cougars. I didn't think it would be a blowout as many people thought. They jumped out early, got challenged in the second and third quarter, and then they pulled it out in the end with Taysom Hill. When you look at Virginia, I like them in the upset against Louisville at home. Very underrated defense. The concern that I have with Virginia is on the offensive side of the ball with the quarterback Lambert and Johns. Are they going to be able to stretch the defense in Provo against a very solid BYU attack? Defensively, I think they can hang in with BYU and really force Taysom Hill into making quick decisions. But from an offensive perspective, Kevin Parks is a majority of that offense, not really sold on the quarterbacks Lambert and Johns at this point. I think BYU picks up a very close victory, and close, I mean 7 to 10 points. I think BYU is the superior team, and because they're playing in Provo, they have the advantage. But I'm very high on Virginia's defense. I think it's one of the best in the ACC.
And you mentioned Houston really giving BYU a game despite the Cougars losing, the Houston Cougars losing a few weeks earlier to Texas San Antonio. 17.5-point underdog, getting blown out early, really make it a game. And now the odds makers really haven't learned their lesson. We shall see, because they love BYU as a 14 or 15-point favorite in this game. All right, more from the ACC. Big doings in the ACC this week, because we've got East Carolina staying on this death march, South Carolina, Virginia Tech. Now they've got North Carolina and East Carolina. They've proven through these two games they're not going to back down with anyone. They could have won the South Carolina game, and they really took it to Virginia Tech. Now they've got a North Carolina team that's been touted by many to play Florida State in the ACC championship game. So how do you like the Heels taking on the Pirates?
Very evenly matched for a couple of reasons, but when you look at it, East Carolina dominated this game last year 55-31. Prior to that meeting, it was dominated by North Carolina. So it's a solid effort with Shane Carden and Justin Hardy in that offense, and credit head coach Ruffin McNeil for their performance last year. Now this is going to be their third tough ball game in a row. You mentioned it. They went on the road to South Carolina. They went on the road to Virginia Tech. This is no slouch in North Carolina coming off a bye week. So a very difficult matchup for East Carolina, but I like their offense. I like Shane Carden. I give them the slight edge in this matchup. I like what they can do in terms of stretching defenses vertically. You talk about Isaiah Jones, another wide receiver that can really put pressure on secondaries, and I like Shane Carden at quarterback. You got to go with the hot team at this point. The slight edge could be a very difficult game, but because of their performance last year over North Carolina, I expect East Carolina to be confident in this ball game.
Okay, Joe, more from the ACC. We've got Miami taking on Nebraska. This is going to be one of the few mentions for the Big Ten during our little video right here, and that speaks to a bad slate in the Big Ten this week, but mostly because things have been that bad in the Big Ten that we just don't really need to talk about the Big Ten, because they've become somewhat irrelevant at this point. But we've got a throwback to Orange Bowl's past, with Nebraska taking on Miami in Lincoln. Your thoughts about this one?
Well, it's turn back time, and I guess I feel very strongly about this game because I'm calling for the upset in Lincoln. When you look at Nebraska's dominating performance last week in Fresno, yes, a solid performance by Amir Abdullah. Gregory came back, had a dominant effort on the defensive side of the ball. They put up a 50 spot on Fresno, but when you look at their combined win totals, they're 3-0 with they're 3-0 over teams that have a combined record mark of 2-7. Not very productive resume for quality of wins for Nebraska. You look at Tommy Armstrong, he's only completing 53% of his passes, and you look at that Cornhusker offense, it revolves solely around, in my opinion, Amir Abdullah. As he goes, so do the Nebraska Cornhuskers. When you look at Miami, very solid defense led by Denzel Perryman. I know they dropped the opening week to Louisville, but they're only giving up about 82 yards of rushing offense, only 177 passing yards per game. Very aggressive defense. They have 11 sacks over 3 ball games, so very quality defensive line. The X factor for Miami, in my opinion, is if Kaya fails early, I think this is a must-win for Al Golden and the staff, not just because it's a Nebraska and it's a resume win. I just think for an emotional effort, look for Heaps to come in. They got him involved a couple of weeks ago. He was 5 of 8, 41 yards. I think Al Golden and the staff throw caution to the wind. You look at Dorsett's performance. He received over 200 yards, receiving yards last week. I expect a dominant effort. I like the edge, speed off the edge by Miami, and I'm calling for the upset 24-20 over Nebraska in Lincoln.
I completely agree. I can't believe that this is a 7-point spread. I understand that Nebraska's at home. I understand that Miami's not elite. I understand they're unsettled at quarterback going with a true freshman in week one, Kaya. But at the same time, if you look at recruiting rankings over the past 3 to 4 years, Miami's recruiting top 10 or 15 athletes. Nebraska's in the 30s. They're bigger, they're stronger. They're not necessarily bigger or stronger. Faster and more athletic at Miami. I just think they have a athleticism edge in this game. Kaya's got a couple games under his belt. It's not going to be a situation where he goes to Louisville on opening night. He's got a few games under his belt. He's faced the hostile crowd and environment at this point. I think Miami's a good play here as well against Nebraska. And wow, if the Big Ten loses this one, this is not necessarily a marquee game or win for Nebraska or the Big Ten, but this is about all that's left on the slate for the Big Ten to salvage anything at this point. While we're down that road with the Big Ten, this one's a kind of an odd matchup. We got Utah and Michigan. Not really a big matchup, but I've got it here with Michigan a slight favorite at home against the Utes. But, of course, Utah with Travis Wilson made it tough on Stanford last year. I could certainly see an upset here, too.
Well, you talk about I believe it was back in 2008 when they were undefeated. They shocked the Michigan Wolverines in Ann Arbor, so they're used to playing there. You look at Kyle Whittingham, a very good game manager, good game coach. When you look at Brady Hoke as a coach right now, really not cultivating that talent and coaching them up, so to speak. You look at Michigan's performance last week, Mark, against Miami of Ohio, struggled in the first half. That was one of the worst statistical offenses in the MAC last year. So they really struggle from a defensive perspective and an offensive perspective against a really bottom of the MAC conference team last year. So not a good performance by Devin Gardner and the offense last week. I wasn't impressed, but this is a must-win game for Michigan. If they drop this game, a lot of pressure on Brady Hoke. I don't think he'll survive. Expect an emotional effort, and somehow, some way, I look for Michigan to pull it out. But I don't think it's a dominant victory. I'm calling for maybe a 10 to 14-point victory. I see maybe 7 points most of the way, and then at the end, Michigan might get a late touchdown. But I don't expect anything else than a Michigan victory because it'll be devastation in Ann Arbor if they don't pull it out.
Yeah, exactly. They better win this game because even though the Big Ten's down, so is Michigan. And if they lose this game and go to 2 losses and then start facing Michigan State and Ohio State and Penn State and everybody else in the Big Ten, wow. I'm just shocked at Brady Hoke comes in, wins a Sugar Bowl with Rich Rod's talent, but still he wins a Sugar Bowl, ignites the program. His recruiting classes have been top 10, top 12 in the country, and wow. They had the season where they win the Sugar Bowl over Virginia Tech. Then the next year they lost games, but they barely lost to Notre Dame, Ohio State, South Carolina in the last few seconds in the Outback Bowl, a top 5 team. I thought this program was just going to take off, and it's just been miserable since there. And if they don't rebound and go at least 8-4, I think Brady Hoke's got to look for another job. All right, let's stay in the ACC for the statement game here. Clemson, Florida State in Tallahassee, of course. Taj Boyd, Sammy Watkins, those guys at home last year couldn't come anywhere close to getting the job done. Florida State may not quite be the team and the juggernaut that they were last year. So Florida State, Clemson in Tallahassee.
Well, when you look at this game, teams coming off byes really haven't performed all that well. When you look at the numbers, the home team over the last 12 years is 10-2. Slight advantage Florida State, but Clemson hasn't lost 3 straight since 2000 to 2002. They've lost back-to-back games. If they lose this one, it'll be the first time since 2000 to 2002 that Clemson has done that. When you look at defensively for the Seminoles, not performing very well in run support, they're giving up 205 rushing yards per game, Mark. That's very uncharacteristic of the Seminoles defense. And when you look at sacks, they've generated 1 sack now throughout the season. That came by Mario Edwards. They're going to need a better effort out of the defense this weekend in order to face a high up-tempo attack led by Cole Stout or Deshaun Watson, whoever's at the quarterback position. But I expect an emotional effort out of Florida State this weekend. I think the inexperience of quarterback will play into Florida State's hand, and I expect Jameis Winston and that offense to get going, Carlos Williams to get involved, involved in that offensive line to start to make a statement, and I expect a dominant Florida State victory on Saturday.
Okay, Joe, we've got potentially a nice little matchup in the Big 12. It's kind of intriguing to me that Oklahoma is the fourth-ranked team in the country, coming off a pretty impressive win against Tennessee, who's probably going to go 6-6, something in that range. West Virginia, I think the odds makers or the betting public out there really loves West Virginia because this line's gone from like 12.5 down to like 7.5 or 8. Maybe they're thinking back to that Alabama opener and how good West Virginia looked with Clint Trickett at quarterback. So Oklahoma has to travel to Morgantown. That can be a little tricky. West Virginia, for as bad as they were last year, gave Oklahoma a pretty good game in 2013.
Well, when you look at it, a couple of factors. Sooners are going to be without Keith Ford, their starting running back. He got injured. He's out for this ball game. Could have put a lot more pressure on Trevor Knight in that offense. Sterling Shepard to stretch West Virginia. When you look at West Virginia, starting cornerback Worley's out. He's got 2 key interceptions last week, so that's going to put pressure on West Virginia's defense. When you look at the last 2 matchups between these teams, last year in Norman, 16-7, OU and that offensive line sort of grounded it out, but West Virginia with a solid performance in Norman defensively. The last time in Morgantown, it was a shootout with Landry Jones. They won that ball game 50-49. So I think the last couple of matchups between these teams have been very, very close. But when I look at this matchup, Mark, I still like the defense led by OU, what they were able to do last week and put a lot of pressure on Justin Worley. They really created a lot of havoc, knocked him down a bunch of times. I like Eric Stryker coming out from the edge. Even though Ford's not playing in this ball game, I give the edge to Oklahoma from the defensive perspective. Yes, West Virginia's playing very well, and Dana Holgerson's on the hot seat. Clint Trickett put up over 500 against Maryland, but defensively, I give the edge to Oklahoma.
Okay. Trip out to the West Coast before we run through the SEC. We've got Stanford. We've got Washington. The Huskies coming off a nice little win against Illinois, but they really haven't played anybody yet. Of course, Stanford with a pretty tough Week 2 loss to USC when they dominated at the line of scrimmage, but had too many red zone penalties and turnovers in that game to get the job done. Stanford, Washington.
I have to go with Stanford because of their blue-collar style of play. I know that they lost to USC, and you see the USC effort last week in Chestnut Hill, and you have to question how strong is USC, and at this point, how strong is Stanford, but in my opinion, still a solid offense and defensive lines that match up very well against the offensive system led by Chris Peterson. I like Kevin Hogan at the quarterback position. He's a winner. He's poised. He makes plays, and David Shaw's a veteran coach. Have to give the edge to Stanford. I think they get a decisive victory.
Okay, your analysis might be about 3 seconds long on this one, but I still jotted this one down. Going to Pullman, the Oregon Ducks. Wow, this could get ugly. Even though Washington State slings it around, wow, they're going to be chasing guys all over the field all night. Washington State hosting Oregon.
I'm not sold on Oregon like everybody else. They're on the road, so that's always a question mark. You look at this game last year. They won the game in Autzen Stadium by 24 points, and you look at Connor Holiday's performance last week. He started to heat up. Mike Leach always likes to have a great game plan in place from an offensive perspective. They might score 200 points in this ball game. I think it could be a little bit closer than people think. I'm not sold on Washington State's defense, but I think they push Oregon a little bit into the fourth quarter. I might see like a 10-point or 17-point Oregon victory, but I think it's close in the first 3 quarters.
Okay, I'm not necessarily sold on Oregon being elite, so don't get me wrong there. I'm more sold on Washington State being horrible, and so I think this game's like 58-24, something like that.
You might be right. You might be right. I have to see. I just, like I said, I want to see Oregon on the road, in an environment outside of Autzen Stadium, and then I'll make a judgment right now. But I would love to see the upset, to be honest with you.
Okay, Joe, we got 2 really, really good games in the SEC. two marginal games, but I'll get your take on South Carolina, Vandy first, and then Texas A&M and Rice.
Well, you have to give credit. You know I was high on Georgia to win the national championship. I was wrong. They still have an outside chance, but they're going to have to run the table. Credit Steve Spurrier and that defense for really stepping up and making plays. But when you look at South Carolina, Vanderbilt, they match up very well. I know James Franklin was head coach last year, but Vandy always plays South Carolina close to the belt. They're coming off an emotional victory over Georgia. How are they going to respond? I know Vanderbilt struggled last week against UMass, but in terms of matching up with South Carolina, I think they do that defensively. South Carolina, don't get me wrong, wins this matchup in Nashville, but I think it's a little bit closer than people think.
And then, not that you need a real winner here because I think the Aggies are going to blow them away, but SMU with a new coach with June Jones stepping down. What are your thoughts about Texas A&M and the South Carolina win and how good they could possibly be?
Well, I think from an offensive perspective, I really like Kevin Sumlin as a head coach and what he was able to do with that week one matchup against South Carolina. They're always a legitimate chance to run the table and be a contender. It's the defense, I think, that has always been a concern the last couple of years since they moved into the SEC conference, not really strong in run support. You look at last year's performance, they gave up 222 yards. But I have to admit, that week one performance, they impressed me. They impressed me against Rice as well. So I want to see how they perform this week. You might see more consistency if that defense comes around like I think it will. They have 8 starters back from last year. Don't count out Texas A&M from playing in the SEC championship game.
Wow, that would be something.
I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying if they get hot and that defense runs around, they're an outside contender as long as they have the ability to move the ball like they do.
Yeah, well, the defense has taken strides. There's no doubt about that. From atrocious last year, they've gotten much better, and they've recruited on that side of the ball, so they should be better in future years. All the talk, preseason talk in the SEC Eastern Division centered around Georgia and South Carolina. To a lesser extent, is Florida going to come back? People dismissed Missouri coming off winning the division last year, but then they come out of the gate, got a nice win against Central Florida, really blew out the Knights 38-10 last week. A lot of people didn't even think they'd go to Toledo the week before and win, and here's Mizzou again, possibly making a run. They're taking on the Indiana Hoosiers.
Well, you look at Indiana last week, a devastating performance for the Big Ten, again, losing to Bowling Green and Dino Babers, but credit the MAC Conference for an upset win, 45-42. When you look at Indiana overall, Nate Sudfeld, only 1 touchdown pass in 2 ball games. Their dominant rushing attack, averaging 345 rushing yards per game. But when you look at that Missouri defense, very opportunistic. They're +6 in turnover margin. They have 11 sacks through 3 ball games, and they're only giving up around 80 yards, right around 100 yards per game in rushing defense. So a very solid effort by Gary Pinkel and that Missouri team. When you look at Matty Mock leading the reins, he's come along as a sophomore. I thought they would struggle in terms of stretching teams vertically because of LaDainian Washington and Doriel Green-Beckham no longer there. But credit that offense from what they're able to do. I don't think Indiana matches up well against Missouri. They're averaging 7.5 penalties per game over the last 2 ball games. 15 penalties through 2 ball games. Not a good sign when you can't stretch the teams vertically like Sudfeld has. Puts a lot of pressure on that offensive line. I think Missouri dominates this matchup, and they're a possible sleeper in the SEC East. They've come right out of the gate from right where they left off last year, where I thought there'd be a drop-off.
Yeah, Indiana hosted Mizzou last year. This is before we knew Mizzou was as good as they became. Again, Sudfeld had a nice game, and Indiana can score on some people, but the defense is just so bad and can't tackle and isn't fast enough to stay with an SEC offense, and it was like a 45-28 kind of game there. So, all right, 2 really good matchups in the SEC. Mississippi State, usually in bowl contention, getting to lesser bowl games, trying to break into that upper tier in the SEC Western Division. LSU, one of those contenders each and every year, although they've got the question marks at quarterback to a certain extent. So LSU, Mississippi State, the Tigers right now about a 10-point pick.
Well, let's be honest. Statistically, LSU's won 14 straight against Mississippi State, so the numbers favor the Mad Hatter and John Chavis on the defensive side of the ball. You have to give them all the credit in the world because all they do is reload and they coach that talent up. LSU hasn't given up a point since the first game against Wisconsin. Very dominant offensive line, and they have a staple of backs: Terrence McGee, Leonard Fournette, and Kenny Hilliard that could really put pressure on Mississippi State. But Mississippi State with a solid defensive line themselves, led by Preston Smith. When you look at that defense, only surrendering 80 rushing yards per game, and they have 11 sacks through 3 ball games. So I like the defensive effort by Mississippi State and what they're able to do. And you mentioned the quarterbacks, Mark. The edge in this matchup has to go to Dak Prescott, the more experienced quarterback. That's not to take away from Anthony Jennings or Brandon Harris, but a more experienced quarterback in Dak Prescott. I think Mississippi State will be in it most of the way, but how can you go against Les Miles and the Baton Rouge Tigers at home? I think it's a very close game, but in the end, LSU gets a 17-13 victory.
All right, Joe, our final game of the week. If we're just going by name brand, this is a big one. Is it a big one the way it used to be, or is Florida not come all the way back? We shall find out. Alabama, Florida in Tuscaloosa. The Gators with the horrible year last year trying to show that they're back to prominence in the SEC. Barely got by Kentucky in overtime in the swamp last week. Bring what could be an elite defense. They have yet to prove it, but they have the pieces in place to be a very top-notch defense. Is Jeff Driscoll in this offense? Have they turned the corner? Is it as advertised that they're going to be able to throw down the throttle and score on big-time defenses? And, of course, Alabama, the quarterback, will finally play the type of defense we would like to see a Blake Sims or a Jake Coker have to face in this one with the Gators at Alabama.
I've been going back and forth with this game, numbers-wise, everything else, and it's sort of contrasting. I'll tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then I'll tell you who I think is going to win. When you look at Florida, they're playing very clean. They're +7 in turnover margin. That's a good, solid fact going on the road to Tuscaloosa. You need to create turnovers, and you need ball security in order to upset Alabama. When you look at the ugly for Florida, 18 penalties through 2 ball games. That's not going to get it done in a big matchup on the road in the SEC. You know that. So they're going to need Jeff Driscoll and that offense to step up and really stretch the field against Alabama. That's the Alabama weak spot. Week 1, you saw it against West Virginia and what Clint Trickett was able to do in exposing that secondary. Very uncharacteristic of Kirby Smart's defense. A key note of this matchup, too, is Tony Brown. He's a freshman cornerback, is starting with the first team for Alabama. Can Driscoll and those wide receivers exploit that is going to be the main question. If you're asking me, does Florida have the same type of sophisticated passing attack that West Virginia does and Clint Trickett? No. So that's a positive for Alabama. Alabama's defense still solid in run support, only giving up 47 rushing yards per game. So they're going to need a balanced attack to offset that. I don't know if Florida can do that at this point. The one negative for Alabama, though, Mark, they're -2 in turnover margin through 3 ball games. They've only created 1 turnover all year. Very uncharacteristic of Nick Saban and Kirby Smart's defense. We know Alabama to be solid in run support, and we also know them to win the turnover battle week in and week out. They haven't done it through 3 ball games. When you look at this matchup, I'm expecting to see the old Alabama. I'll go with the home team and Nick Saban at home just because I'm not sold on Jeff Driscoll and that wide receiver crew to stretch the defense. But it's really a toss-up at this point. But I'll take Alabama at home to make a statement with their first SEC game.
And the stat you just brought up with Alabama only creating 1 turnover in 3 games, that's a very small sample size, but still you got to consider West Virginia put the ball in the air like 50 times, and then the next 2 opponents were far inferior opponents that you would think Alabama would be able to take the football away. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if the Gators are back and if Jeff Driscoll in this offense is different than it's been in the last few years when it's been very pedestrian, and if Florida still has the type of swagger and athletes to stand up to Alabama on the road and make this happen. So if I've got this straight, Joe, you like Mississippi State to scare LSU. You like Miami to go on the road and upset Nebraska, which I don't even think should be an upset, but to win it despite being a 7-point underdog. You like Utah to scare Michigan, but again, is that really an upset? It's in name only an upset. Virginia to scare BYU, but the Cougars to hang on in that one. And those are the real scares that I see, or in that one case with Miami-Nebraska, you like the one upset there.
I do like Miami to upset outright. I think they get the victory in Lincoln. I like Utah to play tough, but in the end, I still see Michigan winning that ball game by at least 2 touchdowns. If they don't, like I said, all hell will break loose in Ann Arbor because a lot of pressure falling on Brady Hoke at this point. How much more mediocre efforts can they have in Ann Arbor with the likes of Penn State playing 3-0 and moving up, and even you have to credit Maryland and Rutgers for what they've been able to do. They have 2 very tough schedules, but in my opinion, they're playing better than Michigan at this point.
Yeah, they are. When Maryland came back on West Virginia and only lost it right at the gun, and they're going to Syracuse this week and could get a decent win against the Cuse in what's pretty much a pick'em game. So, Joe, before we let you go, what you been working on?
Well, I've been featured on Yahoo Sports Radio, and I've been doing some other stuff television-wise, Fantasy Sports Network. You can all find my stuff at goforthechew.com and at Twitter at goforthechew.
Joe, we love the passion and the information. Getting the job done for us. We appreciate it. We'll catch you next time.
Mark, always a pleasure. I love talking college football with you. It's great, isn't it?